For 10 of those 35 years that BCUN has been doing its work, it's been my good fortune to work with Dick Vole, chairman of BCUN and president and CEO of the Rockefeller Group. As board chairman for those last 8 years, Dick has shared with us his deep and unique commitment to the United Nations and to the work of BCUN. This dedication has made it possible for BCUN to prosper. Ladies and gentlemen, Dick Vole.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know that we all recognize what a terrific job Bill Murray did, but Sam and I have been doing this dinner for a number of years, and I'd like to think that not only did Bill Murray do a wonderful job, but we have a great honoree tonight, and I think we all share that feeling. And I'd like to just thank you, Bill, and recognize again the fact that even though we have had heads of states and presidents and prime ministers here in the past, there's something particularly unique about this evening, and I think you'll see why just a little bit later. It also would be really remiss of me not to mention what has been accomplished during this past year with Sam Brookfield as president. We have had an incredible year. Our Second World Congress this past June, whose theme was Free Markets and Free Peoples, was an outstanding success. Planning for our Third World Congress, whose theme is the UN at 50, leading the world to prosperity and peace, is well underway. This year, Sam and Rob Radke, Rob's out there somewhere, our BCUN Vice President, led ambassadors to over 40 cities around the country. Membership is at an all-time high, and the financial wherewithal to support our program content and mission of working with the United Nations is simply the best ever. There's no room today in the United Nations for petty politics, for self-serving bureaucracy, or bland complacency. The stakes are too high, the needs are too urgent. We have a solemn responsibility, all of us, leaders of the member nations, leaders of the United Nations itself, leaders of the private sector within the member nations, to bring this institution into its second half century as a powerful force for peace, for prosperity, for justice, for the hopes of people everywhere. This is what its founders intended and what the challenges ahead require. The world needs an effective United Nations. The United Nations needs a resolute United States. We must pay our bills. We must inspire and we must lead. As Americans with our special responsibilities in the world, we recognize the vital importance of the United Nations. And as New Yorkers, we can take pride in the fact that our city, thanks to the far-sighted gift of the Rockefeller family, is home to this world body. Tonight, we're honoring a member of that family, one with whom I've had the privilege of working for a number of years. Because of that association, I'll let others tonight express the respect and gratitude of this organization for what David Rockefeller and his family have done for the United Nations, for New York, and for the world. But I can't let this go without making one personal note. For those of us at the Rockefeller Group who have had the opportunity to work over the years with David as our chairman, it has been and is an incomparable experience. There is simply no one like him. Now, as a New Yorker, it is my great pleasure to introduce a man who in less than 1 year has brought a renewed sense of hope and pride to this city. Pride in a city that's raising its quality of life, pride in a city that relishes its role as a global capital, and hope that New York can be what those of us who love it feel it is, the international capital of the world. Mr. Mayor, Rudy, thank you for what you've done, thank you for what you're doing and will continue to do, and thank you for being with us tonight to honor David Rockefeller.
Thank you very much, Dick. I love to tell the governor of New York that Albany is the capital of New York State, and I love to tell the President that Washington is the capital of the United States, but New York City is the capital of the world. And one of the reasons that New York City can say that is the presence of the United Nations in the city of New York. So I think it is very fitting that I'm here tonight, and I thank you very much for allowing me to participate. David Rockefeller and the United Nations are names that appear and reappear in the pattern of events that since the end of World War II has endeavored to bring peace to the world. David Rockefeller helped build the institution, and the whole purpose of this institution is to create a world in which we have peace, a world that is regulated by law and fair play. That's an ideal. But ideals are about the reasons why we live our lives and what we try to achieve in our lives. And no one has done that better than David Rockefeller and his family. It's been the high privilege of New York City to have been the geographical host for the partnership between David Rockefeller and the United Nations. New York's participation, however, I don't think is just incidental. It really is hard to imagine any other city in the world that could have done it as well. This year, during the time that I've been privileged to be mayor of New York City, we've had the World Cup, we've had the Gay Games, we've had events that have brought people here from all around the world. And I greet them at Gracie Mansion and at City Hall. And I haven't found one person yet that has come from any continent on the earth or any place in the world in which I can't find someone in New York City that speaks their language, the dialect of their language that they speak, understands their religion, and probably came from the village they came from, no matter how far away it is. And there are cities that challenge us, but no other city that can really make that claim. New York City is the home to 2,500 foreign companies employing more than 100,000 people. More than 350 foreign banks are here in New York City, located here, giving the city the largest international banking presence in the world. Our international banking presence here in New York City is greater than the combined total of Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, San Francisco, and Miami. According to a study by the Regional Planning Association, among American multinational corporations, the larger and more global the company, the more likely it is that it would be headquartered in New York City. Now, these are things that we have to continue to do for the city. The presence of the United Nations here makes that a reality for us. But more important, I think, than even the business that's here, the international commerce that's here, and the communications that are here, are the people that are here, the diverse population of this city. In the last decade, over 800,000 immigrants settled in New York, bringing with them the same thing that my grandparents brought to New York City 100 years ago, or maybe your grandparents, or your parents, or maybe you, or maybe your great-grandparents. But if you go to Kennedy Airport and you watch people coming here from all over the world, you see in their eyes the same thing that built New York and built America. This is a great international city. It's a city that understands the value of immigration and the value of change that people can bring. New York can list so many things that are unique about it, and I think that one of the things that's unique about New York City is that it is home to David Rockefeller. The bonds of intimacy between David Rockefeller and the United Nations and our city are strong and of long duration. In making it possible for the United Nations to come to New York, the Rockefeller family gave expression to a fundamental truth. Where you are counts. And what counts here in New York City is that we really are a microcosm of this planet. What happens around the world finds its way somehow to something that is happening in New York City. In an age even of computer communication and international communication and the ability to communicate with the people by fax and in all kinds of different ways, it still is important to be somewhere, to be in a place, to see people, to deal with them, and to be face-to-face with them. And New York City gives you that opportunity. The Rockefeller family understood that and foresaw that New York was the inevitable home for the United Nations, the geographical center for the voice of humanity. In a brief video introduced by the United Nations Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali and containing some exceptional footage, the connection between the United Nations, New York City, and the Rockefeller Foundation is clearly drawn. So if we could play the video, I really would appreciate your watching it. I think you're going to enjoy it very, very much.
On the eve of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, it is important to recognize more than just an event. Arriving at the critical juncture in history, this anniversary holds immense potential for the peoples of the world. To appreciate, preserve, and strengthen the achievements of the United Nations, to examine new challenges which require creative action, and most importantly, to chart a course for the future. In doing this, it is appropriate to reflect and to draw strengths from the early history of the United Nations. The Rockefeller family embodied the idealism of those years.
John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s early backing of the League of Nations in the 1920s demonstrated the Rockefeller family's commitment to international peaceful cooperation. Grants promoting investigations into the narcotics trade and the traffic in women and children, and his endowment of a League of Nations library were evidence of his moral and financial support. While the League of Nations floundered and ultimately failed, its ideals lived on. As World War II was drawing to a close, a new world organization was conceived, the United Nations. This historic footage shows how the concept became reality.
The idea, initiated at the famous Yalta Conference in the closing days of World War II, was to be followed through to completion by the delegations of some 50 nations, including that of the United States, shown here at a preliminary meeting in Washington. April 25th, 1945, while the war was still raging overseas, the free nations of the world assembled for the first meeting of the historic conference from which was to evolve the final drafting of the charter. The president spoke to the assemblage from a radio microphone in Washington, D.C.
The world has experienced a revival of an old faith in the everlasting moral force of justice. At no time in history has there been a more important conference or a more necessary meeting than this one in San Francisco. You members of this conference are to be the architects of a better world. In your hands rests our future. By your labors at this conference, we shall know if suffering humanity is to achieve a just and lasting peace. If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
On June 25th, 1945, the charter was signed in a formal ceremony by each of the 50 nations present at the conference. Out of the chaos of World War II had come a global brotherhood that carried within its legislative structure the seeds of world peace for the generations to come.
Many tasks were set before the young United Nations, including the resettlement of World War II refugees, the drive to secure fundamental human rights, the struggle to limit the growing proliferation of atomic weapons, and the task of finding a permanent home for the organization. The world looked on as a search was initiated.
Arriving in New York to choose United Nations headquarters, delegates from 7 nations are welcomed by Grover Whalen. They must choose a site within the New York or Boston areas. The committee calls on President Truman at the White House before proceeding to inspect locations. The eastern United States will soon hold the new capital of the world.
Nelson Rockefeller, a former member of the U.S. delegation to San Francisco, was appointed by New York City Mayor O'Dwyer to interest the UN in building on the 1939 fairgrounds in Flushing Meadow. When the UN rejected this proposal, the Rockefeller family considered offering part of their own estate, Pocantico, and adjoining properties for the headquarters site. No decision had been made when the UN convened in the fall of 1946. The Rockefeller family was more concerned than ever with bringing the UN to New York City. News accounts from the period convey the atmosphere.
As the weary delegates of 54 nations prepare to end their meeting, the world takes stock of recent weeks, highlighted by the beginnings of cooperation. Hopeful signs are the unanimously passed resolution on armaments reduction and atomic controls. And there was big news in the last days as headlines told another story. The gift of a site by John D. Rockefeller Jr. for a permanent world capital in New York. Quickly accepted, the strip along Manhattan's East River is valued at $8.5 million. An ideal site for skyscraper headquarters, the 6-block area extends from 42nd to 48th Street.
The Rockefeller family formally presented its gift to the UN in March of 1947.
The future of this country and the lives of our children and our children's children are interwoven with the success of the United Nations. In it lies the hope of the people of the world. My father considers it a privilege to have had a part in the development of its permanent home. I'm glad to hand you, Mr. Lee, my father's check.
Thank you, Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, Mayor Dwyer, the United Nations extends its sincere thanks to you and to your father for this magnificent gift. We intend to go ahead and create on the East River side a dignified and appropriate headquarters for the United Nations, which will stand for generations to come as a great monument to peace and security. Your family can be proud of its contribution to this cause.
Thank you very much.
The Rockefeller gift changed the course of history and brought the United Nations to New York City. It is a gift which gave practical and moral support to the young United Nations, thus enabling it to succeed where the League of Nations had failed. It is a gift which furthered the United Nations mission to help save succeeding generations from the scourge of war.
And the Rockefeller family's commitments to the United Nations did not end with this exceptional gift. It continues to the present day, and it is personified by David Rockefeller, whom we honor for his dedication to democratic principle, for his dedication to development, and for his dedication to international peace.
The Medal of the Business Council for the United Nations is presented every year to an individual who has made a significant contribution to the United Nations and to world peace. Past recipients include Margaret Thatcher, Thomas Pickering, Javier Perez de Cuellar, Mikhail Gorbachev, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush. This evening, the prestige of this famous award is enhanced, again, as it's bestowed upon one of the formidable figures of the 20th century, a force for freedom and peace in the world, David Rockefeller. You hold that. I'm going to list just a very, very few of David's contributions. He was the founder of the America Society, an organization that promotes inter-American cooperation. He helped found the Trilateral Commission, designed to promote understanding and cooperation among the nations of North America, Western Europe, and Japan. He was instrumental in creating the International Executive Service Corps, a group of volunteers from the private sector who provide technical and managerial assistance to private enterprise in developing nations. For 15 years, he served as the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. Among other international achievements, David Rockefeller is the honorary chairman of the Japan Society, an honorary trustee of the International House, and a member of the Advisory Council of the Bilderberg Conference. David, as the mayor of New York City, I want to thank you very, very much for bringing the United Nations to New York City. As a citizen of the United States, I want to thank you very much for all that you have done for America, you and your family. And as a citizen of the world, thank you for everything you've done for world peace.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, I must say I'm quite overwhelmed by this wonderful reception, and I do wish to extend a great many thanks to the mayor and to all of you for this extraordinary offer of an award to me on behalf of my family this evening. I'd have to say that I would like in turn to add my voice to others who have already spoken about Mayor Giuliani for the outstanding leadership that I feel he's provided to this city, something that we greatly needed. In just a short time, as Dick Vole has said, he's reversed a downward trend in the city and is and I think he's given New Yorkers a sense of hope and confidence that we haven't had for a considerable amount of time. Mr. Mayor, we're very grateful to you for that. I think I'd also be remiss if I didn't take this occasion to express my thanks to my good friends Dick Vole and Bill Murray and Sam Brookfield, and to all of you in the Business Council for the United Nations for selecting me as the recipient of this year's well-respected honor and medal. All the more so because in pursuing the names of the 6 previous recipients of the Business Council's medal, I find the following: 1 Secretary General, 1 Ambassador, and 4 heads of state. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I wonder how a mere retired banker could have been allowed to join that distinguished company. But I quickly add that I hasten to accept the award before you change your minds. I've long been an admirer of the works of the Business Council and wholeheartedly endorse its role of encouraging the interest and backing of the business community in the vitally important mission of the United Nations. Now, as the United Nations approaches its 50th anniversary, business support for the numerous internationally related problems in which it is involved has never been more urgently needed. But before sharing with you a few thoughts on the need for strong leadership in the world of today, I think I should just take a moment to express how deeply touched I was by the wonderful film that we've just witnessed, which traced my family's involvement in the early days of the United Nations. My father, as the film suggests, was a man of peace who believed deeply in the ultimate benefits of peaceful cooperation and continuous dialogue among the peoples and nations of the world. Recalling his role and that of my brothers, John and Nelson, as you may have noted, makes this occasion very especially meaningful for me. Had they still been alive, and I wish they were, I would have supported your conferring on one or all of them this award this evening. The film touched me briefly, but it also touched briefly on the history of the United Nations. I'd like to begin my own remarks this evening with a brief reflection on the history of the United States as it sheds light on our own involvement with the United Nations today. The United States, as the saying goes, is a nation of immigrants. The Pilgrims and other early pioneers came here from Britain and Western Europe to escape religious persecution and to find a new life of opportunity and freedom. Subsequent waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe brought both ethnic diversity and exceptional levels of talent and dedication to hard work. The reprehensible slave trade of the 17th and 18th centuries brought Africans to these shores and created institutions and social divisions that took a civil war and more than a century of concentrated effort to overcome. Yet African Americans today have become an essential and positive strand in the fabric of our nation. Most recently, waves of Latinos and Asians have contributed new elements to our rich cultural and ethnic diversity. For more than 400 years, the strength of this nation has lain in our capacity to absorb and transform a complex and diverse population into a homogeneous nation, where a single primary language provides a common basis for communication and mutual understanding. As our nation grew in numbers and expanded across the continent, opportunities flourished for anyone with ability and ambition. Underpinning this process of national expansion was our Constitution, crafted at the moment of our national independence by a group of talented and far-sighted leaders whose principles were firmly rooted in the ideals of democracy and individual freedom. 2 world wars in the first half of this century forced the United States to emerge from its primary preoccupation with internal expansion and economic growth to become a power with global influence and responsibilities. That is the position in which we find ourselves today, as the most powerful nation on earth, near the peak of our worldwide influence and authority. Indeed, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the discrediting of centrally planned economies, the opportunity for enlightened American leadership is perhaps even greater than it was in 1939 at the beginning of the Second World War, or in 1945 when the Cold War began. But this persistent window and this present window of opportunity, during which a truly peaceful and interdependent world order might be built, will not be here open for too long. Already there are powerful forces at work that threaten to destroy all of our hopes and efforts to erect an enduring structure of global cooperation. I refer here to those ruthless advocates of ethnic nationalism who seek to break apart existing nations, as well as to militant fundamentalists who want to subordinate or even eliminate anyone who refuses to comply with their own rigid ideological beliefs. In contrast to those radical and divisive forces, our contemporary world has also seen the emergence of an array of scientific, technological, and economic phenomena that are linking nations more closely together, making enhanced cooperation not only possible, but absolutely imperative. breakthroughs and advances in many fields such as genetics, molecular biology, computers, and telecommunications have given mankind the ability to revolutionize most aspects of our common life. Properly applied, these advances can be used to improve the human condition throughout the world, an objective to which I would believe that we all aspire. Ironically, however, the very innovations that are making possible dramatic improvements in human well-being are also creating new problems which raise the specter of an alarming and possibly catastrophic disaster to the biosphere we live in. And herein lies the dilemma that we all face. Let me illustrate. Improved public health has caused the world's infant mortality rate to decline by 60% over the last 40 years. In the same period, the world's average life expectancy has increased from 46 years in 1950s to 63 years today. This is a development which, as individuals, we can only applaud. However, the result of these positive measures is a world population that has risen during the same short period of time geometrically to almost 6 billion people and could easily exceed 8 billion by the year 2020. The negative impact of population growth on all of our planetary ecosystems is becoming appallingly evident. In particular, the rapid growing exploitation of the world's supply of energy and water is a matter of deep concern, and the toxic byproducts of widespread industrialization have increased atmospheric pollution to dangerous levels. Unless nations will agree to work together to tackle these cross-border challenges posed by population growth, overconsumption of resources, and environmental degradation, the prospects for a decent life on our planet will be threatened. The recent UN meeting in Cairo has appropriately focused on one of these key issues, population growth. But the controversies which have erupted at the conference illustrate the problem of coming to grips with issues that are deeply divisive and which have a profound moral dimension. The United Nations can and should play an essential role in helping the world find a satisfactory way of stabilizing world population and stimulating economic development in a manner that is sensitive to religious and moral considerations. Economic growth is, of course, an inevitable corollary of a growing population and is essential to improve standards of living. But without careful coordination, unrestrained economic growth poses further threats to our environment. This was a major subject of discussion at the conference in Rio de Janeiro on the environment 2 years ago. The focus then was on sustainable growth and global development. It was pointed out at the conference that growth is most efficiently managed by the private sector, but regulation of the process by national governments and international bodies is also needed. And once again, the United Nations should certainly be among the catalysts and coordinators of this process. But in addition, given the importance of unencumbered international trade in stimulating and facilitating economic growth, some of the newer economic entities, such as the European Economic Community, NAFTA, APEC, and most importantly, GATT, now known as the World Trade Organization, are probably best suited to play a major role in ensuring sustainable development. A common requirement for dealing with all of these challenges, technological, environmental, political, and economic, is leadership. Leadership coupled with mutual trust and understanding. There is no magic formula for finding and producing leadership. We've seen many fine examples of it in very small nations as well as among the great powers. I believe that most of the world is anxiously searching for strong and effective leadership, even a great moral vision for the future. And it looks to the United States to play that role. In my opinion, we have no choice but to become more intimately involved in the resolution of the complex problems that I have outlined. And it is clearly in our national interest for us to do so. I recognize that calling for expanded international involvement is not a particularly popular proposition in the United States today, at a moment when domestic concerns and isolationist leanings have a tendency to dominate the debate. But as we have seen in recent months in Bosnia and Rwanda, in North Korea and Somalia, in Haiti and Cuba, the fabric of social life can be torn very easily, and the effects inevitably spill across borders with harmful consequences to us all. I do not believe that the United States can afford to look the other way. Although we no longer teeter on the edge of nuclear abyss, the world is still a very dangerous place. And I fear that without stronger and more focused American leadership, it will become even more dangerous. A U.S. foreign policy that is marked by drift and ad hocery, having little clarity or vision, leaves our nation and the world vulnerable to geopolitical disaster. What is needed is a foreign policy that follows a coherent, strategically defined direction based on an understanding of history and national interest, but also well attuned to the needs of other nations. The world's complex problems cannot be taken up neatly in an orderly sequence. Instead, we must be prepared to deal with issues systematically and often simultaneously as they arise. This will require a well-coordinated foreign policy establishment and a decision-making structure that is given comparable importance with domestic policy components of our national government. I do not for a moment wish to suggest that world leadership on the part of the United States should imply world domination. Clearly, it does not and should not. Nor does it mean the U.S. must alone assume the mantle of leadership or become the world's policeman. But like it or not, we live in a global society. We must understand it. We must comprehend the forces that are affecting it, and we must act forcefully to protect our own interests as well as to promote the continued progress of all the world's peoples. In accepting the Business Council's medal last year, President Bush said, "Real peace is not an accident, it's an art form, the result of planning and patience and sometimes personal diplomacy." In his personal message to the program for tonight's event, Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali noted that the reaffirmation and strengthening of democratic principles is of particular importance at this time. I agree, of course, with both of these propositions. I would only add that ultimately the strength and security of our nation derives from the purposefulness, self-discipline, and character of our own people. At this pivotal moment in our history, we cannot afford to hide our heads in the sand. We must make sure that 200 years of scientific progress, economic growth, and democratic rule are allowed to serve as the basis for our positive and constructive leadership in the family of nations in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again from the bottom of my heart for the honor that you have bestowed on me this evening. Thank you very much.